The congregation knew her as the janitor. She swept in silence, smiled politely, and never missed a Sunday. Until Veterans Day, the choir rose and sang her call sign instead of a hymn. Murmurs turned into gashes, and eyes filled with tears as she stood frozen, remembering a sky once filled with fire. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories about hidden heroes whose service runs deeper than what meets the eye, consider subscribing for more content that explores how the quiet ones often carry the heaviest burdens with the greatest grace. The morning dew still clung to the stone steps of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa, when Margaret Maggie Sullivan arrived at 0630 hours every Sunday morning with her cleaning supplies and the quiet determination that had defined her life for the past 8 years. At 52, she moved with the efficient precision of someone who understood that attention to detail mattered, whether scrubbing church floors or performing the duties that had once made her one of the most decorated helicopter pilots in the United States Air Force. Her small frame and graying hair made her nearly invisible to the congregation members who hurried past her as she methodically swept the entrance, polished the brass fixtures, and ensured that every surface in the 150-year-old church gleamed with the reverence appropriate for Sunday worship. Most parishioners offered polite nods or brief smiles, recognizing her as the reliable custodian who had maintained their sacred space with unwavering dedication since moving to Cedar Falls from parts unknown. What they didn't know, what Maggie had never shared during countless conversations about weather, local events, and church activities, was that her methodical approach to cleaning reflected the same systematic precision that had once guided her through combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, where split-second decisions and flawless execution determined whether soldiers on the ground lived or died under circumstances that tested every aspect of human courage and technical competence. The morning routine that began with cleaning church steps had become Maggie's anchor to civilian life, providing structure and purpose that helped manage the psychological challenges of transitioning from military service that had defined her identity for 24 years. The quiet sanctuary offered peace that contrasted sharply with memories of rotor blades, machine gun fire, and desperate radio calls from ground units that needed immediate evacuation from situations where enemy fire made survival impossible without air support. "Good morning, Maggie," called Father Michael O'Brien as he arrived for early preparation before the 8 a.m. service, his Irish accent still evident after 30 years of ministry in small-town Iowa. "Beautiful morning for worship, isn't it?" Maggie looked up from polishing the door handles, offering the gentle smile that had become her trademark among parishioners who appreciated her quiet competence and reliable presence. "Good morning, Father. The church is ready for service. I've prepared the altar and cleaned the fellowship hall for coffee hour." Father O'Brien paused, noting the precision with which Maggie had arranged everything in the sanctuary, from perfectly aligned hymnals to spotless windows that allowed morning light to illuminate the stained glass in ways that enhanced the spiritual atmosphere. Her work exceeded normal custodial duties, reflecting pride and attention to detail that suggested deeper connection to the sacred space than simple employment. "Maggie, your care for this church goes beyond what we could ask for," Father O'Brien said, his voice carrying genuine appreciation for service that had transformed the building's appearance and functionality. "This place has never looked better, and I know the congregation appreciates everything you do." What Father O'Brien didn't understand was that Maggie's meticulous care for the church reflected the same commitment to mission accomplishment that had characterized her military service, where lives depended on perfect maintenance of aircraft systems and flawless execution of procedures under conditions that allowed no margin for error or casual performance. The church bells began ringing at 0745 hours as congregation members started arriving for Sunday worship, their conversations filling the sanctuary with the comfortable sounds of community gathering for shared spiritual experience. Maggie retreated to the back of the church where she always sat during services, occupying a corner pew that allowed her to observe the congregation while remaining unobtrusive. Her position at the back of the sanctuary also provided clear sight lines to all exits and allowed rapid departure if the crowds or confined spaces triggered anxiety responses that had been manageable but persistent since her medical retirement from active duty following injuries sustained during her final combat mission in Afghanistan. The congregation of St. Matthew's represented the demographic diversity of small-town Iowa: farmers, teachers, retired professionals, and young families whose children attended Sunday school, while their parents participated in worship that connected them to traditions spanning generations of Cedar Falls residents. They were good people whose biggest challenges involved crop prices, school board elections, and whether the high school football team would make the state playoffs. Maggie envied their normalcy while appreciating the community they had created in a place where her past remained unknown and her present identity was defined by reliable service rather than military achievements that seemed increasingly distant from civilian life that operated according to different priorities and values. At exactly 0800 hours, the service began with traditional opening hymns led by the church choir under the direction of Mrs. Ellen Patterson, a retired music teacher whose enthusiasm for choral music had elevated the small-town choir to performance levels that attracted visitors from neighboring communities. The choir included 16 voices representing various ages and musical backgrounds united by shared commitment to enhancing worship through music. Today's service held special significance as the church observed Veterans Day with prayers for military personnel and recognition of congregation members who had served in various conflicts throughout American history. The bulletin included names of deceased veterans who had been church members, along with prayers for current military families whose loved ones were deployed in overseas operations. Father O'Brien's sermon addressed themes of service and sacrifice that resonated with military experience, but his civilian perspective couldn't fully capture the complexities of military service that included profound satisfaction for meaningful work combined with psychological costs that continued long after discharge from active duty. Maggie listened to the sermon while managing memories that had been triggered by references to military service and combat operations. Her techniques for managing post-traumatic stress included breathing exercises and mental focus strategies that enabled participation in activities that might otherwise become overwhelming due to sensory stimulation or emotional content. The service proceeded through traditional liturgical elements including responsive readings, prayers, and musical selections chosen to honor military service while maintaining appropriate religious focus. The congregation participated with genuine reverence that reflected their respect for military sacrifice, even though most had no personal experience with combat operations or military culture. As the service approached its conclusion, Mrs. Patterson stood to direct the choir for what the bulletin listed as the closing hymn. However, instead of traditional religious music, she began conducting an arrangement that started with unfamiliar musical elements that gradually resolved into something that made Maggie's blood freeze in recognition. The choir's voices rose in harmony that recreated the sound of helicopter rotor blades, building to musical representation of radio communications and engine noise that formed the background for what became unmistakably clear as military aviation music honoring helicopter crews who had served in combat operations. Apache 6-4, This is Thunder 1-2. The choir sang in careful harmony, recreating radio calls that only someone with military aviation experience would recognize as authentic communications between ground units and helicopter support during combat operations. Maggie's hands gripped the pew in front of her as the musical performance continued with radio transmissions that she recognized from her own combat missions, including desperate calls for medical evacuation and close air support that had defined the most intense periods of her military service. The congregation sat in stunned silence as they began understanding that the choir was performing something specifically related to military aviation, though most couldn't comprehend the technical accuracy of the radio communications being recreated through musical arrangement that demonstrated extensive research and preparation. Thunder 1-2, We have wounded personnel requiring immediate evacuation. The choir continued, their voices creating harmonies that somehow captured both the urgency of combat communications and the musical beauty appropriate for church worship. Maggie felt tears beginning to form as memories flooded back from missions where similar radio calls had directed her to landing zones under enemy fire, where wounded soldiers waited for evacuation that meant the difference between life and death for personnel who depended on helicopter crews willing to risk everything for mission accomplishment. The musical performance continued with recreations of her own radio transmissions from combat missions, including her call sign, Thunder 1-2, and responses that had coordinated medical evacuations, ammunition resupply, and close air support that had saved countless lives during operations throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. Thunder 1-2 inbound, 3 minutes to landing zone. The choir sang with harmonies that somehow captured both the mechanical precision of military communications and the emotional weight of life-saving missions performed under conditions that tested every aspect of human courage and technical competence. Father O'Brien rose from his seat with an expression of surprise that matched the confusion visible throughout the congregation as they witnessed a musical performance that had clearly been planned without his knowledge or authorization, replacing the traditional closing hymn with something that seemed specifically designed to honor military aviation service. The choir's performance reached its climax with musical recreation of combat radio traffic that included Maggie's most decorated mission, a medical evacuation operation under intense enemy fire that had saved 12 wounded soldiers, while her helicopter sustained significant battle damage that forced emergency landing procedures requiring every aspect of her flying skills and crew coordination. Thunder 1-2 taking fire, continuing approach to wounded personnel. The choir sang with voices that captured the determination and professional competence that had characterized Maggie's response to situations where mission accomplishment required accepting extreme personal risk for the sake of soldiers who needed immediate evacuation. Maggie stood abruptly, her emotional control failing as the musical performance recreated memories of her most challenging combat mission in detail that could only have resulted from extensive research into classified military records and interviews with personnel who had participated in operations that few civilians would ever understand or appreciate. The congregation turned to look at her with growing recognition that the musical performance was somehow directed specifically toward the quiet custodian whose background had remained mysterious throughout 8 years of faithful service to their church community. Thunder 1-2, wounded personnel secured, departing landing zone under fire. The choir concluded with harmonies that captured both the relief of successful mission completion and the ongoing danger that characterized helicopter operations in combat environments where enemy fire continued threatening aircraft and crew throughout evacuation procedures. The church fell into absolute silence as the musical performance ended, with congregation members beginning to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary that connected their custodian to military service that exceeded anything they had imagined about the woman who had cleaned their church with such quiet dedication. Father O'Brien approached Maggie with an expression that combined pastoral concern with genuine amazement at discovering that his custodian possessed military background that included combat service of obvious significance and distinction. "Maggie," Father O'Brien said gently, his voice carrying the compassion appropriate for addressing someone whose emotional response indicated deep personal connection to the musical performance. "Would you like to share anything with the congregation about your service?" Maggie wiped away tears while struggling to find words that could bridge the gap between civilian expectations and military realities that included experiences most people couldn't comprehend even with detailed explanation. "I flew helicopters," she said simply, her voice barely audible in the silent sanctuary. "Medical evacuations, mostly, in Iraq and Afghanistan." The simple statement carried weight that resonated throughout the congregation as they began understanding that their custodian had served in combat operations that had saved lives under conditions that required extraordinary courage and technical competence. Mrs. Patterson approached from the choir loft with tears in her eyes and hands trembling with emotion from directing a musical performance that had clearly required extensive preparation and research into classified military operations. "Maggie, my grandson, served as a medic in Afghanistan," Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice carrying gratitude that had motivated months of preparation for this moment. "He told me about a helicopter pilot who saved his unit during an attack in 2018. Call sign Thunder 1-2. When I learned you were living here, I knew we had to honor your service." The revelation explained how the choir had obtained information about Maggie's combat missions and call sign, but it also revealed that her military service had touched lives in ways that extended far beyond her awareness or recognition. The congregation began standing as understanding spread throughout the sanctuary that their custodian was not simply a retired military member, but a combat veteran whose service had directly saved lives, including potentially someone connected to their own church community. "Ma'am," said a young man in the third pew, his voice carrying emotion that suggested personal connection to military service. "I'm Jason Patterson. Mrs. Patterson is my grandmother. You saved my life and 11 other soldiers when our convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. I never got to thank you properly." The recognition created an emotional moment that connected past military service with present civilian life in ways that Maggie had never expected when she chose to settle in Cedar Falls, seeking anonymity and peace away from memories of combat operations. More congregation members began approaching as the service concluded, sharing stories of family members who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and expressing gratitude for military service that had protected American interests and personnel in dangerous overseas operations. The spontaneous recognition ceremony continued in the fellowship hall during coffee hour as congregation members learned about Maggie's military background and combat service that had earned numerous decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism during medical evacuation operations under enemy fire. "Maggie, why didn't you ever tell us about your service?" asked Mary Thompson, a longtime church member whose own son had deployed to Iraq with the Iowa National Guard. Maggie's response reflected the complex relationship that many veterans experience between military service and civilian life, where combat experiences remain difficult to discuss with people who lacked military background or understanding of operational realities. "Military service was my job for 24 years, Maggie replied, her voice carrying quiet dignity that had characterized her approach to both military service and civilian life. "When I retired, I wanted to find peace and purpose in helping this community. Your church became my home, and taking care of it became my way of continuing to serve." The conversation revealed that Maggie's transition to civilian life had been deliberate and thoughtful, seeking anonymity that would allow healing from combat trauma while finding meaningful work that provided structure and community connection without the intensity and recognition that had characterized military service. Father O'Brien announced that the church would establish the Thunder 1-2 Memorial Fund to support veteran transition services and military family assistance programs, honoring Maggie's service while addressing ongoing needs in the community for veteran support and recognition. The Memorial Fund reflected the congregation's desire to transform their newfound knowledge of Maggie's service into practical assistance for other veterans who might be struggling with transition challenges or needing community support for reintegration into civilian life. Over the following weeks, word of Maggie's military background spread throughout Cedar Falls as congregation members shared the story of discovering that their church custodian was a decorated combat veteran whose service had saved lives during some of the most dangerous military operations in recent American history. The recognition brought unexpected changes to Maggie's quiet life as community organizations invited her to speak about military service. Local businesses offered discounts and recognition for veterans, and the high school asked her to participate in educational programs about military aviation and veteran experiences. While appreciating the community's respect and recognition, Maggie remained committed to her custodial duties at St. Matthew's, understanding that her work there provided stability and purpose that complemented rather than replaced her military identity and service record. The church custodial position had become more than employment. It represented successful transition to civilian purpose that honored military service while building new community connections based on reliable service and genuine care for others. 6 months after the Veterans Day recognition ceremony, Maggie was invited to serve on the city's Veterans Affairs Committee, where her expertise in military transition issues and community service provided valuable perspective for developing programs that assisted veterans and military families throughout the region. The committee assignment reflected community recognition that Maggie's combination of military experience and civilian community involvement provided unique qualifications for addressing veteran needs and building bridges between military and civilian communities. Her approach to veteran services emphasized practical assistance and quiet support rather than ceremonial recognition, understanding that many veterans preferred meaningful help with transition challenges over public acknowledgement of military service that might create unwanted attention or emotional difficulty. Today, Maggie continues her custodial duties at St. Matthew's while serving as director of the Regional Veterans Transition Center, where her systematic approach to community service has helped hundreds of veterans successfully integrate into civilian life while maintaining connection to military identity and service values. Her leadership philosophy emphasizes practical support and comprehensive assistance as essential components of veteran transition services, producing programs that address both immediate needs and long-term adjustment challenges that veterans face when adapting to civilian life after military service. The Transition Center she established integrates systematic support services with community partnership programs that connect veterans with employment opportunities, educational resources, and social support networks that facilitate successful civilian reintegration while honoring military service and sacrifice. Mrs. Patterson continues directing the church choir while also coordinating musical programs for veteran recognition events throughout the region, using her musical talents to honor military service and create emotional connections between veteran experiences and community appreciation for military sacrifice. Maggie taught us that heroes often serve quietly among us. Mrs. Patterson reflects during interviews about the impact of discovering their custodian's military background. Her example showed us that the most meaningful service often occurs without recognition or fanfare, performed by people who choose duty over acclaim. The recognition extends beyond individual appreciation to systematic changes in how the Cedar Falls community identifies and supports veterans, with programs that recognize military service while respecting veterans' preferences for privacy and integration rather than constant acknowledgement of military background. Maggie's influence on veteran services extends through training programs where community leaders learn systematic approaches to veteran support that honor military service while addressing practical transition needs that determine successful civilian reintegration and long-term community contribution. The quiet custodian who cleaned church steps every Sunday proved that military service creates lasting bonds that transcend time and geography, demonstrating that combat veterans often continue serving their communities through civilian roles that maintain the values and commitment that characterize their military careers. Her story demonstrates that veteran transition requires community support that recognizes military service while enabling veterans to build civilian identities that integrate military experience with new purposes and relationships that provide meaning and stability in post-military life. The church steps that she had cleaned with such dedication continue to welcome congregation members who now understand that their custodian's service extended far beyond building maintenance to include military service that had saved lives and protected American interests in some of the most dangerous operations of recent conflicts. The Veterans Day recognition that revealed Maggie's call sign and combat service continues to influence how St. Matthew's honors military service, with annual recognition programs that celebrate veteran contributions while respecting individual preferences for privacy and integration rather than constant acknowledgement of military background. Maggie's legacy demonstrates that military service creates bonds that endure long after discharge from active duty, connecting veterans with communities that appreciate military sacrifice while supporting transition to civilian roles that maintain the values and commitment that characterize their military service and continue through community contribution and quiet leadership. 3 years after the Veterans Day recognition that had transformed her quiet life into community leadership, Maggie found herself standing before the Iowa State Veterans Commission in Des Moines, where state officials had gathered to address the growing challenge of veteran suicide and the need for comprehensive support programs that could reach veterans who remained isolated from traditional VA services and community support networks. The statistics are devastating. Maggie addressed the assembled commissioners, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose personal experience with veteran transition challenges had been validated through successful community program development. We're losing 22 veterans per day to suicide, many of whom never connected with available resources because they preferred anonymity over recognition. Traditional veteran services often require veterans to identify themselves and acknowledge their military background before receiving assistance. But many veterans, especially combat veterans dealing with trauma, prefer to integrate quietly into civilian communities without constant reminders of military service that might trigger difficult memories. The commission room included representatives from VA medical centers, veteran service organizations, and state agencies whose responsibility for veteran welfare had been complicated by the reality that many veterans actively avoided programs that emphasized military identity over civilian integration and practical assistance. Commissioner Sarah Martinez, herself a Navy veteran whose administrative background had prepared her for state-level policy development, recognized the significance of Maggie's insights for addressing gaps in veteran services that traditional programs hadn't identified or addressed effectively. Major Sullivan, your experience developing community-based veteran support demonstrates alternative approaches that we need to understand and potentially replicate throughout Iowa. Commissioner Martinez noted during the policy discussion. How do we identify and assist veterans who prefer anonymity while ensuring they receive appropriate support for transition challenges? Maggie's response reflected years of practical experience developing programs that honored veteran preferences for privacy while providing comprehensive assistance for transition challenges that affected employment, housing, healthcare, and social integration into civilian communities. Commissioner Martinez, effective veteran support requires community partnerships that identify needs without requiring formal disclosure of military status. Maggie explained, using detailed analysis of program effectiveness to support her recommendations for policy development and resource allocation. Community organizations like churches, employers, and social service agencies often interact with veterans who haven't disclosed military backgrounds but demonstrate behavioral patterns or life circumstances that suggest veteran status and potential need for specialized assistance. Her presentation included statistical analysis of veteran outcomes in Cedar Falls and surrounding communities that demonstrated superior integration success rates among veterans who received community-based support compared to those who relied solely on traditional VA services that emphasized military identity over civilian transition goals. The data revealed significant improvements in employment stability, housing security, and mental health outcomes among veterans who participated in community programs that provided practical assistance while respecting preferences for privacy and civilian integration rather than military-focused services. These improved outcomes reflect community integration approaches that honor veteran service while enabling successful civilian identity development. Maggie continued, presenting analysis that showed consistent patterns of superior adjustment among veterans who received comprehensive support that addressed both practical needs and psychological transition challenges. Veterans who participate in community-based programs demonstrate enhanced civilian integration, reduced isolation, and improved mental health outcomes compared to those who receive only traditional veteran services that may inadvertently reinforce military identity in ways that complicate civilian adjustment. Colonel James Rodriguez, representing the Iowa National Guard's Family Support Services, recognized the implications of Maggie's findings for military families throughout the state who faced deployment-related stress and reintegration challenges that extended beyond individual veteran needs to include spouse and children adjustment issues. Major Sullivan, your community integration model suggests applications for military family support that could address spouse employment, children's educational needs, and family stability issues that affect retention and readiness throughout the Guard and Reserve components, Rodriguez noted. Maggie's systematic approach to community support had indeed identified family integration as a critical component of veteran success that required comprehensive programs addressing employment assistance for military spouses, educational support for military children, and social integration for families whose military lifestyle had created unique challenges and perspectives. The commission session resulted in Maggie's appointment as director of the Iowa Veterans Community Integration Initiative, a statewide program that would apply her systematic approach to veteran support across rural and urban communities throughout Iowa's 99 counties. Her appointment reflected recognition that veteran support required innovative approaches that combined traditional VA services with community partnerships that could reach veterans and families who needed assistance but preferred integration over identification as military-focused program participants. The Community Integration Initiative under Maggie's leadership developed partnerships with employers, educational institutions, healthcare providers, and social service organizations that could identify and assist veterans without requiring formal disclosure of military status or participation in programs that emphasized military identity over civilian goals. The objective is seamless integration that honors military service while enabling successful civilian identity development, Maggie explained during the initiative's inaugural planning conference. Veterans should receive appropriate support for their service-related needs while building civilian careers, relationships, and community connections that reflect their post-military goals and values. The program methodology she developed included systematic training for community partners in recognizing veteran-related challenges and providing appropriate referrals and assistance without stigmatizing military service or requiring acknowledgement of veteran status as a prerequisite for receiving help. Initial implementation of Maggie's community integration model in 12 pilot counties demonstrated significant improvements in veteran outcomes, with enhanced employment rates, reduced homelessness, and improved mental health indicators among participants who received community-based support compared to control groups receiving only traditional veteran services. Major Sullivan's community integration approach has produced measurable improvements in veteran adjustment that exceed traditional service delivery models, reported Dr. Jennifer Chun, the University of Iowa researcher who conducted independent evaluation of the pilot program outcomes. Veterans participating in community integration programs demonstrate superior civilian adjustment, enhanced social connections, and reduced symptoms of post-traumatic stress compared to veterans receiving conventional VA services that emphasize military identity and specialized veteran treatment approaches. The success of Maggie's pilot programs attracted attention from federal officials, resulting in her invitation to testify before the House Veterans Affairs Committee about innovative approaches to veteran support that could be applied nationally to address gaps in traditional VA services. Her congressional testimony emphasized the importance of community partnerships and civilian integration approaches that honored veteran service while enabling successful transition to post-military identity and civilian career development that utilized military skills in appropriate civilian contexts. Veterans bring valuable skills, experience, and leadership capabilities to civilian communities, Maggie testified before the committee. Effective support programs should facilitate successful application of military strengths to civilian opportunities while addressing service-related challenges that might impede transition without overwhelming veterans with military-focused services. The congressional hearing resulted in federal funding for expansion of community integration programs to 15 additional states, with Maggie serving as national coordinator for implementation of systematic approaches to veteran support that emphasized civilian integration over military-specific service delivery. Her federal appointment required relocation to Washington, D.C., but Maggie maintained her custodial position at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church through weekend commutes that preserved her connection to the community that had provided healing and purpose during her own veteran transition experience. The church community celebrated Maggie's federal appointment while ensuring that her weekend visits included continued participation in worship services and fellowship activities that maintained relationships built over 8 years of faithful service and community contribution. Maggie represents the best of military service translated into civilian leadership, Father O'Brien reflected during a special recognition service. Her example demonstrates how veterans can serve their communities through diverse roles that utilize military values and experience while building civilian careers that contribute to national welfare. The recognition ceremony included participation by Jason Patterson, now completing medical school with career goals influenced by his combat experience and subsequent recovery, supported by military medical personnel, including helicopter crews who had risked their lives for wounded soldier evacuation. Major Sullivan saved my life in Afghanistan, but her community service and veteran advocacy have saved countless other lives through programs that help veterans find purpose and healing in civilian communities, Patterson said during the ceremony. Her influence extends far beyond individual rescue missions to systematic assistance that transforms lives and communities. Similar recognition came from veteran organizations throughout Iowa and neighboring states, where community integration programs based on Maggie's model had demonstrated effectiveness in addressing veteran suicide prevention homelessness reduction, and employment assistance that traditional VA programs hadn't reached effectively. 2 years after beginning her federal appointment, Maggie's community integration initiative had expanded to 37 states with documented improvements in veteran outcomes that attracted international attention from countries seeking to improve their own veteran support services and transition assistance programs. Representatives from Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom participated in training programs developed by Maggie's federal office, learning systematic approaches to veteran community integration that honored military service while facilitating successful civilian identity development. And community contribution. Major Sullivan's community integration model represents innovative approaches to veteran support that can be adapted to different national contexts and military service systems, observed Dr. Margaret Thompson of the International Veterans Affairs Research Consortium during a policy conference in Ottawa. Her systematic emphasis on civilian integration while honoring military service provides frameworks for veteran support that address both practical transition needs and psychological adjustment challenges that affect veteran welfare and community contribution in democratic societies worldwide. The international recognition led to Maggie's selection for the United Nations Veterans Affairs Advisory Panel, where her expertise in community integration and veteran transition would contribute to international standards for veteran support and post-conflict reintegration programs that addressed both individual veteran needs and community stability requirements. Her UN appointment represented recognition that veteran transition issues transcended national boundaries and required systematic approaches that could be applied across different cultural contexts and military service systems, while respecting local traditions and community structures. Today, Maggie continues her federal coordination responsibilities while serving as a consultant for international veteran transition programs and maintaining her weekend custodial duties at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where her example continues to inspire community service and veteran appreciation. Her leadership philosophy emphasizes systematic community support and comprehensive integration assistance as essential components of veteran welfare, producing programs that honor military service while enabling successful civilian identity development and community contribution that utilizes military skills and values in appropriate civilian contexts. The training programs she developed for community integration continue to influence veteran support services throughout North America and allied countries, with systematic approaches to civilian transition that respect veteran preferences for privacy, while providing comprehensive assistance for employment, housing, healthcare, and social integration challenges. Mrs. Patterson continues directing the church choir while also coordinating musical programs for veteran recognition events throughout the Midwest, using her musical talents to honor military service and create emotional connections between veteran experiences and community appreciation that respects individual preferences for recognition versus privacy. Maggie taught our entire community that military service creates lifelong bonds and responsibilities that extend far beyond individual recognition. Mrs. Patterson reflects during interviews about the long-term impact of discovering their custodian's military background and subsequent community leadership development. Her example demonstrated that the most meaningful service often occurs quietly, performed by people who choose community contribution over personal recognition while maintaining the values and commitment that characterize their military service and continue through civilian leadership and systematic assistance for others. The recognition extends beyond individual career achievement to systematic changes in how communities throughout North America identify and support veterans, with programs that honor military service while respecting veteran preferences for integration and civilian identity development rather than constant acknowledgement of military background. Jason Patterson, now Dr. Patterson working in emergency medicine, established the Thunder 1-2 Medical Scholarship for military dependents pursuing healthcare careers, recognizing Maggie's influence on his own career development and desire to contribute to veteran welfare through professional medical service. The scholarship program reflects the ripple effects of Maggie's military service and civilian community leadership, demonstrating how individual veteran contributions create lasting positive impacts that extend across generations and influence career choices that serve both military and civilian communities. Today's community integration programs throughout the United States and allied countries incorporate systematic approaches to veteran support that reflect Maggie's demonstration of how military service creates enduring values and capabilities that enhance civilian communities while requiring appropriate support for successful transition and integration. Her influence on veteran services extends through training programs where community leaders learn systematic approaches to veteran identification and support that honor military service, while addressing practical transition needs that determine successful civilian reintegration and long-term community contribution. The quiet custodian who cleaned church steps every Sunday proved that military service creates lasting obligations and opportunities for continued service that transcend individual recognition, demonstrating that veteran transition requires community understanding and support that enables successful integration while honoring the values and experience that military service develops and maintains. Maggie's story demonstrates that veteran transition is both individual and community responsibility, requiring systematic support that addresses practical needs while enabling veterans to build civilian identities that integrate military experience with new purposes and relationships that provide meaning and stability in post-military life. The church steps that she had cleaned with such dedication continue to welcome congregation members who understand that veteran service extends far beyond military careers to include civilian community leadership that maintains military values while addressing contemporary challenges that affect veteran welfare and community stability. The Veterans Day recognition that revealed Maggie's call sign and combat service continues to influence how communities throughout North America honor military service through practical support that respects individual preferences while ensuring veterans receive appropriate assistance for transition challenges that affect their successful integration into civilian life and community contribution. Her legacy demonstrates that military aviation heroism translates directly into civilian leadership capabilities that serve communities through systematic program development and policy advocacy that addresses veteran needs, while building bridges between military and civilian communities that enhance understanding and support for continued veteran service through diverse civilian roles and community contribution.